Welcome to my channel. This is Adam Kyle Jackson, where we talk all things photography and just about anything I feel like talking about at the moment. So, what I feel like talking about at the moment is why was my head cut off? Why am I not knowing where to look? It's because I'm having to film on my new Mac right now, which fortunately is 1080p. But I would typically be filming with my Nikon Z7 or equivalent camera, but this is the subject of the video today. So I'm going to talk about, in general, what I think of it. It's not really a review video. I don't like doing the product reviews. I also don't want to get into any kind of like negativity and pitting brands against others because everything's got its weaknesses and strengths. But for today, we're specifically going to be talking about time lapse photography and interval shooting mode. And if I am going to compare, I'm really going to compare Nikon to Nikon. And so this is a D750. I graduated from my D850 up to the Z7 II, and it's a fantastic camera. So the raw files, absolutely crisp, sharp, low noise, infinite dynamic range. The highlights are, to me, the highlight recovery on this camera is better than anything I've ever seen. And I've shot with a lot of different cameras over the years, including D750, D850, some Canon stuff, Sony A7R3, Sony A7R4, which I held for maybe 3 weeks before I sent it back and got this one. I may do a video on that later. But what I'm seeing with these still images is if you were just to give me the raw file from this and not tell me where it came from and said, hey, I'm shooting medium format, I might believe you. So I'm able to expose to the right on almost every image with such extreme exposure to the right without blowing out highlights that shadow recovery has become really a thing of the past because I'm properly exposing the shadows. But I'm also able to bring the highlights down to where I still have all the details. So the expose to the right method is fantastic on this camera. So that's some of the positives. The other is the lenses. So I've gotten the 14 to 24, 2.8. I've had the old 14 to 24, 2.8, both fantastic lenses. But this is just in a league of its own. I mean, the detail, the clarity, the barrel distortion from the old lens seems to be reduced in this one, and the amount of detail on the edges is just fantastic. I felt like the old lens may have had some focusing issues. It was a little soft on the edges as you go out, especially when you're at 14 millimeters. But this one, I mean, I was able to crop in almost infinitely and still maintain detail, sharpness, clarity, all those things you want to look for in an image. Everything's in focus, not a lot of distortion. So, what's my beef with this? What's the issue here? Well, I started time-lapse photography this year. I'm not a time-lapse expert, never have been, and I got interested in it when I saw some like really cool videos online and saw how do I do this? How do I make this happen with these storms? I've always just been taking the stills of the storms, and to get myself educated on the subject, and I'll give a plug here for Mike Olbinski. I took a lesson from him on time lapse, and I think I learned more in that 2 hours than I would have struggling with this over the course of 6 months. So if you haven't taken lessons on time lapse and you're considering doing it, I'll put a link down below. I'm not affiliated with them. I have, I don't get any kickbacks. This is just a great resource that if you're looking to improve your time lapse and get some best practices, I mean, a 2 hour session was really what it took for me to take it to the next level. And from that session, from the training, I had been doing my time lapses wrong. I'd been picking the wrong interval for storms. I've been doing 3 seconds, 5 seconds, etc., and really needed to be doing 1 second. And so 1 second interval for specifically storm photography is critical. It's key. It's not like doing a time lapse for Milky Way. It's very dynamic. Lighting changes, shifts. You may have a tornado in one frame, may have lightning in another frame. You may have blue skies in the next frame. And so storms are a ever-changing environment, very complex environment to shoot in with the highlights, the shadows, and making sure the camera is metering accurately. And so what I've learned was, let's do this manually. Let's do the exposure control manually by constantly watching the meter and adjusting the shutter speed to ensure that you're not going to have any flicker or major deviations from frame to frame, so that way when you go to compile for the video later, there's not flicker or just this extreme difference to where you're going to have to fix it in post processing. So let's take the Z7 II, let's put this on the table, and let's take a look at the D750, which is really what I learned time lapse on, including the D850. And these cameras are rock solid, bulletproof in the rain. They are excellent for ruggedness. I mean, this thing has sustained some serious storm abuse and just keeps on rocking. And there's some things that I like about the older style versus the Z7 is this top display actually shows you the exposure. So versus the Z7 now, the display on the back is what shows you where you're at from a meter perspective, or you can see it real time. So for some reason, I don't know why, maybe it's a real estate issue, but Nikon took away this ability to see where you're at on exposure, which is kind of annoying. And so I've got to either review my image or let the camera go to auto to get the exposure correct. And so it's kind of one of those things where, like, I went from D850 going to flagship. I should not lose that kind of feature. But that being said, when you put this in interval mode, you're using the internal camera's interval control, not time-lapse movie mode, but just interval shooting raw images that you intend to compile later, you can just watch this display. And so as your storm is rolling through, the sun peeks through, oh, I need to adjust the shutter speed. The clouds get darker, I need to adjust the shutter speed again. And so there's a lot of dynamic situations during a storm sequence where you're constantly touching the shutter dial and moving back and forth. And the whole idea is I want to keep the ISO as low as possible. I don't want the ISO to adjust up to like ISO 6400 for no reason when all I had to do in the first place was drag the shutter and get a better exposure with the best ISO available. So with this camera, it's full cruise control. Once you hit the button, hit start, the camera allows you to touch anything, adjust anything, and not stop the interval. So now let's put the D750 down and let's go back to the Z7 II. Make sure I'm looking at the right spot. Z7 II, however, if you look at the top display, there's no more exposure. There's no more exposure. So the exposure is now moved to here. So I can see the meter here. So if I move the shutter back and forth, here is my reference point now for metering, and it's fine if you're doing stills and you're constantly reviewing the back screen, or even in the viewfinder, you can see it. But I got so used to seeing it up here, I didn't realize how important that was, how integral it was to just my photography. So maybe it's just me, it's a little nitpick. But what happens when you switch to the interval mode, this is where this is a game changer. This is where, and I know this is probably a very small niche. I don't know if anybody out there really has to do 1 second intervals, and maybe you're good with the 2 second, 3 second, 5 second, 10 second. I need 1 second intervals for doing the storms. And in order to do so with this camera, what happens per the Nikon manual is you are able to change the shutter speed in between intervals. I said, okay, let's try that. And so at 1 second, it's firing off every second. And I started messing with the dial and nothing happened. So then I started doing some tests. So I said, okay, let's go to 10 second intervals and let's see if the camera does anything different. It was at 10 seconds that I realized I see a problem here. So at the 10 second interval, once the fire of the shutter happened and then it stopped, and then I touched this dial here, a preview showed up. And the preview showed up, it looked just like this, except it says interval mode. And I said, okay, well, I haven't fired the next exposure yet because I've got 10 seconds in between them. Let's see if we can change the shutter. And it let me do it. So that means that, yes, you can change the shutter speed when you're in manual mode with the Z7 II, but there is a time frame that has to take place. So the sequence is this. Once that shutter closes, and that first interval is done, and you've got the timer start to the next interval, you have to push the dial to move the shutter, which tells the camera, okay, you want to adjust exposure. Well, the problem with the Z7 II is that in interval mode, during the actual exposure, for whatever reason, and I don't know if it's circuitry, I don't know if it's, they just didn't think about it, but they black the entire camera out. They lock you out. So once this thing is, if it's 10 seconds, 20-second exposure, doesn't matter what it is, if you're in interval mode, all functionality is blacked out, which to me, I just don't know why they did that. So once the shutter closes though, it opens you back up to, I can now change this dial, but the problem is because it was previously blacked out, the camera has to think about it and generate a preview, which takes time. So then it generates a preview, pops up and says interval mode, and it tells you here's what the exposure is. Then you may change and then you adjust. Then the camera takes time to register your adjustment. Then it moves on to the next interval. I calculated very roughly, it's about 3 seconds for that whole process to take place, meaning that if you're trying to do intervals less than 3 seconds, you're not going to be able to control your camera's exposure manually. So what does that mean? From a interval perspective, if you're using the internal camera's interval, not external, that means that you are limited to about 5 seconds from my test. 5 seconds. At 10 seconds, you had plenty of time. You had tons of time to change the exposure. So if anyone out there from Nikon's listening, please, please, maybe release a firmware update, do something different. So my buddy, Mike Olbinski, again, links down below if you want some good training for doing time lapse. He made me feel a little bit better. He's talking about, hey man, I just use an external intervalometer. I said, okay, I hope Nikon's got one. I've never used one before. I'm not an expert at the external intervalometer. I kind of got spoiled using the D850, and I'm looking at it from a, well, where do I go next perspective. And like I said, I'm not going to get into the Sony saga or trashing any brand between brands. I just wanted to have this strictly compare Nikon to Nikon. I think that's a fair assessment, and that if I'm paying, you know, $3,500 plus another $3,000, close to $7,000 for a new system, I shouldn't feel like I've lost something going from D850 to the Z7 II. And I think we've got some comments here. So how do you like this camera compared to the D850 from Lawrence here? Well, if we wanted to compare, you know, just from a still perspective, the Z7 II, in my opinion, all day long, and I hate using the word trounces because the D850 was such a great camera, the image quality is fantastic. It's so good that even with this interval issue, how big it may be with trying to do like storm photography and doing the time lapses, I'm gonna hang on to the Z7 II. It's just that good. So also the functionality, the other things I love about it is the lightweight. So just the one thing that you'll notice coming from D850, especially if you're using the D850 and the 14 to 24 and you're using that, holding it handheld, the first thing you notice is how lightweight, just really how lightweight. And when I say lightweight, it doesn't feel like a toy. The construction's solid. It's got the body, it's got the nice finish, even the rubber, the feels good, the grip. I thought it was going to be too small coming from the D850. All the controls are also the same. So you don't really have to relearn the camera. And so the benefit though, I mean, all I care about at the end of the day is image quality. That's everything else, you know, I can live with subtle nuances or little nitpicks and gripes here and there, but the image quality, and I think a lot of it has to do also with these new Z lenses, and the image quality coming out of this is just absolutely just astounding, mind-blowingly good. And I'll go on record saying that this image quality is better than the D850. So I think that your safe bet, if you're considering doing an upgrade from D850 to the Z7 II, that you will be happy, unless you're doing intervals and you're relying on the internal interval to do less than 3 second intervals, then I think you might have an issue. So just wanted to hop on here real quick and just give you my thoughts on the Z7 II and its interval mode. And if you guys have a solution for this, please put it in the comments below. If you've tried something and you're like, hey, I figured something out, please let me know. And otherwise, let's all gang up on Nikon and say, please, during a firmware release, there's got to be a way that you can release the functionality of the camera, not lock us completely out of the functions when you're taking exposure for interval mode. So, all right, thank you all for your time today. This is Adam Kyle Jackson. Catch me on the next video. I'm going to go try to compare the D750 and D7 II. We're going to go do some holy grail time lapses, and I'm going to use the program auto mode on this Z7 II because Nikon claims that that's just as good as doing manual. So if that is the case, I'll hop back on here and I'll recant everything I just said. All right, y'all have a good evening.